to spot and reject discriminatory ads that violate our commitment to fair housing. And yet a year later, a follow-up story by ProPublica said that those changes hadn't fully been made, and it was still possible to target housing advertisement in a way that was racially discriminatory. And my concern is that this practice of making bold and engaging promises about changes in practices and then the reality of how Facebook has operated in the real world are in persistent tension. Several different senators have asked earlier today about the 2011 FTC consent decree that required Facebook to better protect users' privacy. And there are a whole series of examples where there have been things brought to your attention where Facebook has apologized and has said we're going to change our practices and our policies, and yet there doesn't seem to have been as much follow-up as would be called for. At the end of the day, policies aren't worth the paper they're written on if Facebook doesn't enforce them. And I'll close with a question that's really rooted in an experience I had today as an avid Facebook user. I woke up this morning and was notified by a whole group of friends across the country asking if I had a new family or if there was a fake Facebook post of Chris Coons. I went to the one they suggested. It had a different middle initial than mine. And there's my picture with Senator Dan Sullivan's family. Same schools I went to, but a whole lot of Russian friends. Dan Sullivan's got a very attractive family, by the way. And
keep that for the record there, Mr. Chairman.
The friends who brought this to my attention included people I went to law school with in Hawaii and our own Attorney General in the state of Delaware. And fortunately, I've got, great folks who work in my office. I brought it to their attention. They pushed Facebook, and it was taken down by midday. But I'm left worried about what happens to Delawareans who don't have these resources. It's still possible to find Russian trolls operating on the platform. Hate groups thrive in some areas of Facebook, even though your policies prohibit hate speech and you've taken strong steps against extremism and terrorists. But is a Delawarean who's not in the Senate going to get the same sort of quick response? I've already gotten input from other friends who say they've had trouble getting a positive response when they've brought to Facebook's attention a page that's, frankly, clearly violative of your basic principles. My core question is, isn't it Facebook's job to better protect its users? And why do you shift the burden to users to flag inappropriate content and make sure it's taken down?
Senator, there are a number of important points in there, and I think it's clear that this is an area, content policy enforcement, that we need to do a lot better on over time. The history of how we got here is we started off in my dorm room with not a lot of resources and not having the AI technology to be able to proactively identify a lot of this stuff. So just because of the sheer volume of content, the main way that this works today is that people report things to us, and then we have our team review that. And as I said before, by the end of this year, we're going to have more than 20,000 people at the company working on security and content review because this is important. Over time, we're going to shift increasingly to a method where more of this content is flagged up front by AI tools that we develop. We've prioritized the most important types of content that we can build AI tools for today, like terror-related content, where I mentioned earlier that our systems that we deploy, I think, are taking down 99% of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda related content that we take down before a person even flags them to us. If we fast forward 5 or 10 years, I think we're going to have more AI technology that can do that in more areas. And I think we need to get there as soon as possible, which is why we're investing in that.
I couldn't agree more. I just think we can't wait 5 years to get housing discrimination and personally offensive material out of Facebook. Thank you.
I agree.
Chairman.
Senator Sass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, thanks for being here. At current pace, you're due to be done with first round of questioning by about 1 a.m., so congratulations. I like Chris Coons a lot, with his own family or with Dan Sullivan's family. Both are great photos. But I want to ask a similar set of questions from the other side, maybe. I think the conceptual line between mere tech company, mere tools, and an actual content company, I think it's really hard. I think you guys have a hard challenge. I think regulation over time will have a hard challenge. And you're a private company, so you can make policies that maybe less than First Amendment full spirit embracing, in my view, but I worry about that. I worry about a world where when you go from violent groups to hate speech in a hurry, in one of your responses to one of the opening questions, you may decide, or Facebook may decide, it needs to police a whole bunch of speech that I think America might be better off not having policed by one company that has a really big and powerful platform. Can you define hate speech?
Senator, I think that this is a really hard question, and I think it's one of the reasons why we struggle with it. There are certain definitions that we have around, calling for violence or.
Let's just agree on that. If somebody's calling for violence, that shouldn't be there. I'm worried about the psychological categories around speech. You used language of safety and protection earlier. We see this happening on college campuses all across the country. It's dangerous. 40% of Americans under age 35 tell pollsters they think the First Amendment is dangerous because you might use your freedom to say something that hurts somebody else's feelings. Guess what? There are some really passionately held views about the abortion issue on this panel today. Can you imagine a world where you might decide that pro-lifers are prohibited from speaking about their abortion views on your content, on your platform?
I certainly would not want that to be the case.
But it might really be unsettling to people who've had an abortion to have an open debate about that, wouldn't it?
It might be, but I don't think that would fit any of the definitions of what we have. But I do generally agree with the point that you're making, which is as we're able to technologically shift towards, especially having AI proactively look at content, I think that that's going to create massive questions for society about what obligations we want to require companies to fulfill. And I do think that that's a question that we need to struggle with as a country, because I know other countries are, and they're putting laws in place. And I think that America needs to figure out and create the set of principles that we want American companies to operate under.
Thanks. I wouldn't want you to leave here today and think there's sort of a unified view in Congress that you should be moving toward policing more and more and more speech. I think violence has no place on your platform. Sex traffickers and human traffickers have no place on your platform. But vigorous debates, adults need to engage in vigorous debates. I have only a little less than 2 minutes left, so I want to shift gears a little bit. But that was about adults. You're a dad. I'd like to talk a little bit about social media addiction. You started your comments today by talking about how Facebook is and was founded as an optimistic company. You and I have had conversations separate from here. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think as you've aged, you might be a little bit less idealistic and optimistic than you were when you started Facebook. As a dad, do you worry about social media addiction as a problem for America's teens?
Well, my hope is that we can be idealistic but have a broad view of our responsibility. To your point about teens, this is certainly something that I think any parent thinks about, is how much do you want your kids using technology? At Facebook specifically, I view our responsibility as not just building services that people like, but building services that are good for people and good for society as well. So we study a lot of effects of well-being of our tools and broader technology. And like any tool, there are good and bad uses of it. What we find in general is that if you're using social media in order to build relationships, right? So you're sharing content with friends, you're interacting, then that is associated with all of the long-term measures of well-being that you would intuitively think of. Long-term health, long-term happiness, long-term feeling connected, feeling less lonely. But if you're using the internet and social media primarily to just passively consume content and you're not engaging with other people, then it doesn't have those positive effects and it could be negative.
We're almost at time, so I want to ask you one more. Do social media companies hire consulting firms to help them figure out how to get more dopamine feedback loops so that people don't want to leave the platform?
No, Senator. That's not how we talk about this or how we set up our product teams. We want our products to be valuable to people, and if they're valuable, then people choose to use them.
Are you aware of other social media companies that do hire such consultants?
Not sitting here today.
Thanks.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
In response to Senator Blumenthal's pointed questions, you refused to answer whether Facebook should be required by law to obtain clear permission from users before selling or sharing their personal information. So I'm going to ask it one more time. Yes or no? Should Facebook get clear permission from users before selling or sharing sensitive information about your health, your finances, your relationships? Should you have to get their permission? That's essentially the consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission that you signed in 2011. Should you have to get permission? Should the consumer have to opt in?
Senator, we do require permission to use the system and to put information in there and for all the uses of it. I want to be clear. We don't sell information. So regardless of whether we could get permission to do that, that's just not a thing that we're going to go do.
So would you support legislation? I have a bill, Senator Blumenthal referred to it, the Consent Act, that would just put on the books a law that said that Facebook and any other company that gathers information about Americans has to get their permission, their affirmative permission, before it can be reused for other purposes. Would you support that legislation to make it a national standard for not just Facebook, but for all the other companies out there, some of them bad actors? Would you support that legislation?
Senator, in general, I think that principle is exactly right, and I think we should have a discussion around how to best
No, but
codify
would you
that.
support legislation to back that general principle, that opt-in, that getting permission is the standard? Would you support legislation to make that the American standard? Europeans have passed that as a law. Facebook's going to live with that law beginning on May 25th. Would you support that as the law in the United States?
Senator, as a principle, yes, I would. I think the details matter a lot.
Right,
And
but
now that-
assuming that we work out the details, you do support opt-in as the standard, getting permission affirmatively as the standard for the United States. Is that correct?
Senator, I think that's the right principle. And 100 billion times a day in our services, when people go to share content, they choose who they want to share
So
it affirmatively.
you could support a law that enshrines that as the promise that we make to the American people, that permission has to be obtained before their information is used. Is that correct?
Senator, yes, I've
Okay.
said that in principle. I think that makes sense,
Okay.
and the details matter. And I look forward to having our team work with you on fleshing that out.
Right. So the next subject, because I want to, again, I want to make sure that we kind of drill down here. You earlier made reference to the Child Online Privacy Protection Act of 1999, which I am the author of. So that is the Constitution for child privacy protection online in the country, and I'm very proud of that. But there are no protections additionally for a 13, a 14, or a 15-year-old. They get the same protections that a 30-year-old or a 50-year-old get. So I have a separate piece of legislation to ensure that kids who are under 16 absolutely have a privacy bill of rights, and that permission has to be received from their parents or the children before any of their information is reused for any other purpose other than that which was originally intended. Would you support a child online privacy bill of rights for kids under 16 to guarantee that that information is not reused for any other purpose without explicit permission from the parents or the kids?
Senator, I think as a general principle, I think protecting minors and protecting their privacy is extremely important. And we do a number of things on Facebook to do that already, which I'm happy to get
And I
into if
appreciate
that's
I'm
helpful.
talking about a law. I'm talking about a law. Would you support a law to ensure that kids under 16 have this privacy bill of rights? I had this conversation with you in your office 7 years ago about this specific subject in Palo Alto. And I think that's really what the American people want to know right now. What is the protections? What are the protections that are going to be put on the books for their families, but especially for their children? Would you support a privacy bill of rights for kids where opt-in is the standard? Yes or no?
Senator, I think that that's an important principle.
I
And
appreciate that.
And I think we
Do
should.
we need a law to protect those children? That's my question to you. Do you believe we need a law to do so? Yes or no?
Senator, I'm not sure if we need a law, but I think that this is certainly a thing that deserves a lot of discussion.
And again, I couldn't disagree with you more. We're leaving these children to the most rapacious commercial predators in the country who will exploit these children unless we absolutely have a law on the books.
Please.
And I
Senator,
think it is absolutely
Please give a short answer.
Senator, I look forward to having my team follow up to flesh out the details of it.
I don't think this is a
Senator
difficult
Flake. Senator
issue
Flake.
to get a correct answer to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Thanks for enduring so far. And I'm sorry if I plow old ground. I had to be away for a bit. Myself and Senator Coons, Senator Peters, and a few others were in the country of Zimbabwe just a few days ago. We met with opposition figures who had talked about, their goal is to be able to have access to state-run media in many African countries, many countries around the world, third world countries, small countries. The only traditional media is state-run. And we asked them how they get their message out, and it's through social media. Facebook provides a very valuable service in many countries for opposition leaders or others who simply don't have access, unless maybe just before an election, to traditional media. So that's very valuable, and I think we all recognize that. On the flip side, we've seen with the Rohingya, that example of where the state can use similar data or use this platform to go after people. You talked about what you're doing in that regard, hiring more traditional or local language speakers. What else are you doing in that regard to ensure that these states don't, or these governments go after opposition figures or others?
Senator, there are three main things that we're doing in Myanmar specifically, and that will apply to other situations like that. The first is hiring enough people to do local language support, because the definition of hate speech or things that can be racially coded to incite violence are very language specific, and we can't do that with just English speakers for people around the world, so we need to grow that. The second is, in these countries there tend to be active civil society who can help us identify the figures who are spreading hate, and we can work with them in order to make sure that those figures don't have a place on our platform. The third is that there are specific product changes that we can make in order to that might be necessary in some countries but not others, including things around news literacy, right? And encouraging people in different countries about ramping up or down things like that we might do around fact-checking of content, specific product-type things that we want to implement in different places. But I think that that's something that we're going to have to do in a number of countries.
There are obviously limits, native speakers that you can hire or people that have eyes on the page. Artificial intelligence is going to have to take the bulk of this. How much are you investing and working on that tool to do what really we don't have or can't hire enough people to do?
Senator, I think you're absolutely right that over the long term, building AI tools is going to be the scalable way to identify and root out most of this harmful content. We're investing a lot in doing that, as well as scaling up the number of people who are doing content review. One of the things I've mentioned is in this year, or in the last year, we've basically doubled the number of people doing security and content review. We're going to have more than 20,000 people working on security and content review by the end of this year. So it's going to be continuing to grow the people who are doing review in these places with building AI tools, which we're working as quickly as we can on that, but some of the stuff is just hard. That, I think, is going to help us get to a better place on eliminating more of this harmful content.
Thank you. You've talked some about this, I know. Do you believe that Russian and or Chinese governments have harvested Facebook data and have detailed data sets on Facebook users? Has your forensic analysis shown you who else other than Cambridge Analytica downloaded this kind of data?
Senator, we have kicked off an investigation of every app that had access to a large amount of people's data before we locked down the platform in 2014. That's underway. I imagine we'll find some things, and we are committed to telling the people who are affected when we do. I don't think sitting here today that we have specific knowledge of other efforts by those nation states, but in general, we assume that a number of countries are trying to abuse our systems.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Person is Senator Hirano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has proposed a new extreme vetting initiative, which they have renamed Visa Life Cycle Vetting. That sounds less scary. They have already held an industry day that they advertised on the federal contracting website to get input from tech companies on the best way to, among other things, and I'm quoting ICE, exploit publicly available information such as media, blogs, public hearings, conferences, academic websites, social media websites such as Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn to extract pertinent information regarding targets. And basically what they want to do with these targets is to determine, and again I'm quoting the ICE's own document, they want, ICE has been directed to develop processes that determine and evaluate an applicant's, i.e. target's probability of becoming a positively contributing member of society, as well as their ability to contribute to national interests in order to meet the executive order, that is the president's executive order. And then ICE must also develop a mechanism or methodology that allows them to assess whether an applicant intends to commit criminal or terrorist acts after entering the United States. The question to you is, does Facebook plan to cooperate with this extreme vetting initiative and help the Trump administration target people for deportation or other ICE enforcement?
Senator, I don't know that we've had specific conversations around that. In general,
Well, if you were asked to provide or cooperate with ICE so that they could determine whether somebody's going to commit a crime, for example, or become fruitful members of our society, would you cooperate?
we would not proactively do that. We cooperate with law enforcement in two cases. One is if we become aware of an imminent threat of harm, then we will proactively reach out to law enforcement, as we believe is our responsibility to do. The other is when law enforcement reaches out to us with a valid legal subpoena or request for data. In those cases, if their request is overly broad or we believe it's not a legal request, then we're going to push back aggressively.
Well, let's assume that ICE doesn't have a law, there's no law or rule that requires that Facebook cooperate to allow them to get this kind of information so that they can make those kinds of assessments. It sounds to me as though you would decline.
Senator, that is correct.
Is there some way that, well, I know that you determine what kind of content would be deemed harmful. So do you believe that ICE can even do what they are talking about, namely through a combination of various kinds of information, including information that they would hope to obtain from entities such as yours, predict who will commit crimes or present a national security problem? Do you think that that's even doable?
Senator, I'm not familiar enough with what they're doing to offer an informed opinion on that.
Well, you have to make assessments as to what constitutes hate speech. That's pretty hard to do. You have to assess what election interference is. So these are rather difficult to identify, but wouldn't trying to predict whether somebody's going to commit a crime fit into the category of pretty difficult to assess?
Senator, it sounds difficult to me. All of these things, like you're saying, are difficult. I don't know, without having worked on it or thinking about it, how much progress one
would
could make.
tell us that that's pretty difficult, and yet that's what ICE is proceeding to do. You were asked about discriminatory advertising, and in February of 2017, Facebook announced that it would no longer allow certain kinds of ads that discriminated on the basis of race, gender, family status, sexual orientation, disability, or veteran status, all categories prohibited by federal law and housing. And yet, after 2017, it was discovered that you could, in fact, place those kinds of ads. So what is the status of whether or not these ads can currently be placed on Facebook? And have you followed through on your February 2017 promise to address this problem? And is there a way for the public to verify that you have, or are we just expected to trust that you've done this?
Senator, those are all important questions. And in general, it is against our policies to have any ads that are discriminatory.
Well, you said that you wouldn't allow it, but then, what is it, ProPublica could place these ads even after you said you would no longer allow these kinds of ads. So what assurance do we have from you that this is going to stop?
Well, two things. One is that we've removed the ability to exclude ethnic groups and other sensitive categories from ad targeting. So that just isn't a feature that's even available anymore. For some of these cases where it may make sense to target proactively a group, the enforcement today is still, we review ads, we screen up front, but most of the enforcement today is still that our community flags issues for us when they come up. So if the community flags that issue for us, then our team, which has thousands of people working on it, should take it down. We'll make some mistakes, but we try to make as few as possible. Over time, I think the strategy would be to develop more AI tools that can more proactively identify those types of content and do that filtering up front.
So it's a work in progress.
Thank you, Senator Hirono.
Yeah.
Senator Sullivan's
Thank
up
you.
next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Zuckerberg, quite a story, right? Dorm room to the global behemoth that you guys are, only in America. Would you agree with that?
Senator, mostly in America.
You couldn't do this in China, right? Or what you did
Well-
in 10 years.
Well, Senator, there are some very strong Chinese internet companies.
Right, but you're supposed to answer yes to this question. Okay, come on, I'm trying to help you, right? I mean, give me a break. You're in front of a bunch of... The answer is yes, okay? So thank you. Now, your testimony, you have talked about a lot of power. You've been involved in elections. I thought your testimony was very interesting, really all over the world. The Facebook, 2 billion users, over 200 million Americans, 40 billion in revenue. I believe you and Google have almost 75% of the digital advertising in the U.S. One of the key issues here is Facebook too powerful? Are you too powerful? And do you think you're too powerful?
Well, Senator, I think most of the time when people talk about our scale, they're referencing that we have 2 billion people in our community. And I think one of the big questions that we need to think through here is the vast majority of those 2 billion people are outside of the U.S. And I think that that's something that, to your point, that Americans should be proud of. And when I brought up the Chinese internet companies, I think that that's a real strategic and competitive threat that in American technology policy we should be thinking about.
Let me get to another point here real quick. I don't want to interrupt, but you know, when you look at kind of the history of this country and you look at the history of these kind of hearings, right? You're a smart guy. You read a lot of history. When companies become big and powerful and accumulate a lot of wealth and power, what typically happens from this body is there's a instinct to either regulate or break up, right? Look at the history of this nation. You have any thoughts on those two policy approaches?
Well, Senator, I'm not the type of person who thinks that all regulation is bad. So I think the internet is becoming increasingly important in people's lives, and I think we need to have a full conversation about what is the right regulation, not whether it should be or shouldn't be.
Let me talk about the tension there, because I think it's a good point, and I appreciate you mentioning that. You know, one of my worries on regulation, again, with a company of your size, you're saying, hey, we might be interested in being regulated, but as you know, regulations can also cement the dominant power. So what do I mean by that? You know, you have a lot of lobbyists. I think every lobbyist in town is involved in this hearing in some way or another, a lot of powerful interests. You look at what happened with Dodd-Frank. That was supposed to be aimed at the big banks. The regulations ended up empowering the big banks and keeping the small banks down. Do you think that that's a risk, given your influence, that if we regulate, we're actually going to regulate into you into a position of cemented authority, when one of my biggest concerns about what you guys are doing is that the next Facebook, which we all want, the guy in the dorm room, we all want that to start it, that you are becoming so dominant that we're not able to have that next Facebook. What are your views on that?
Well, Senator, I agree with the point that when you're thinking through regulation, across all industries, you need to be careful that it doesn't cement in the current companies that are winning.
But would you try to do that? Isn't that the normal inclination of a company to say, hey, I'm going to hire the best guys in town and I'm going to cement in an advantage? You wouldn't do that if we were regulating you?
Senator, that certainly wouldn't be our approach. But I think part of the challenge with regulation in general is that when you add more rules that companies need to follow, that's something that a larger company like ours inherently just has the resources to go do, and that might just be harder for a smaller company getting started to be able to comply with.
Correct.
So it's not something that, like, going into this, I would look at the conversation as what is the right outcome. I think there are real challenges that we face around content and privacy and in a number of other areas, ads transparency, elections.
Let me get, I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me get to one final question that kind of relates to what you're talking about in terms of content, regulation, and what exactly Facebook is. You know, you mentioned you're a tech company, a platform, but there's some who are saying that you're the world's biggest publisher. I think about 140 million Americans get their news from Facebook, and when you mentioned to Senator Cornyn, you said you are responsible for your content. So which are you? Are you a tech company, or are you the world's largest publisher? Because I think that goes to a really important question on what form of regulation or government action, if any, we would take.
Senator, this is a really big question. I view us as a tech company because the primary thing that we do is build technology and products.
But you said you're responsible for your content, which makes you kind of a publisher, right?
Well, I agree that we're responsible for the content, but we don't produce the content. I think that when people ask us if we're a media company or a publisher, my understanding of what the heart of what they're really getting at is, do we feel a responsibility for the content on our platform? The answer to that, I think, is clearly yes. But I don't think that that's incompatible with fundamentally at our core being a technology company where the main thing that we do is have engineers and build products.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Udall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Mr. Zuckerberg, for being here today. You spoke very idealistically about your company, and you talked about the strong values, and you said you wanted to be a positive force in the community and the world. And you were hijacked by Cambridge Analytica for political purposes. Are you angry about that?
Absolutely.
And you're determined, and I assume you want changes made in the law. That's what you've talked about today.
Senator, the most important thing that I care about right now is making sure that no one interferes in the various 2018 elections around the world. We have an extremely important U.S. midterm. We have major elections in India, Brazil, Mexico, Pakistan, Hungary coming up. And we're going to take a number of measures, from building and deploying new AI tools that take down fake news, to growing our security team to more than 20,000 people, to making it so that we verify every advertiser who's doing political and issue ads, to make sure that that kind of interference that the Russians were able to do in 2016 is going to be much harder for anyone to pull off in the future.
And I think you've said earlier that you support the Honest Ads Act, and so I assume that means you want changes in the law in order to effectuate exactly what you talked about.
Senator, yes, we support the Honest Ads Act.
And so
we're implementing it.
Are you going to come back up here and be a strong advocate to see that that law is passed?
Senator, the biggest thing that I think we can do is implement it.
Well, that's a kind of a yes or no question there. I hate to interrupt you, but are you going to come back and be a strong advocate? You're angry about this? You think there ought to be change, there ought to be a law put in place. Are you going to come back and be an advocate to get a law in place like that?
Senator, our team is certainly going to work on this. What I can say is the biggest
I'm
thing
talking about you, not your team.
Well, Senator, I try not to
come back
come
here
to
and be an
DC.
advocate for that law. That's what I want to see. I mean, you're upset about this. We're upset about this. I'd like a yes or no answer on that one.
Senator, I'm posting and speaking out publicly about how important this is. I don't come to Washington, D.C. too often. I'm going to direct my team to focus on this. And the biggest thing that I feel like we can do is implement it, which we're doing.
Well, the biggest thing you can do is to be a strong advocate yourself, personally, here in Washington. Just let me make that clear. But many of us have seen the kinds of images shown earlier by Senator Leahy. You saw those images that he held up. Can you guarantee that any of those images that can be attributed or associated with the Russian company Internet Research Agency have been purged from your platform?
Senator, no, I can't guarantee that because this is an ongoing arms race. As long as there are people sitting in Russia whose job it is to try to interfere with elections around the world, this is going to be an ongoing conflict. What I can commit is that we're going to invest significantly because this is a top priority to make sure that people aren't spreading misinformation or trying to interfere in elections on Facebook. But I don't think it would be a realistic expectation to assume that as long as there are people who are employed in Russia for whom this is their job, that we're going to have zero amount of that or that we're going to be 100% successful at preventing that.
Now, beyond disclosure of online ads, what specific steps are you taking to ensure that foreign money is not financing political or issue ads on Facebook in violation of U.S. law? Just because someone submits a disclosure that says paid for by some 501c3 or PAC, if that group has no real person in the U.S., how can we ensure it is not foreign interference?
Senator, our verification program involves two pieces. One is verifying the identity of the person who's buying the ads, that they have a valid government identity. The second is verifying their location. So if you're sitting in Russia, for example, and you say that you're in the U.S., then we'll be able to make it a lot harder to do that because what we're actually going to do is mail a code to the address that you say you're at. And if you can't get access to that code, then you're not going to be able to run ads.
Yeah. Now, Facebook is creating an independent group to study the abuse of social media in elections. You've talked about that. Will you commit that all findings of this group are made public no matter what they say about Facebook or its business model? Yes or no answer?
Senator, that's the purpose of this group, is that Facebook does not get to control what these folks publish. These are going to be independent academics, and Facebook has no prior publishing control. They'll be able to do the studies that they're doing and publish the results.
And you're fine with them being public? And what's the timing on getting those out?
Senator, we're kicking off the research now. Our goal is to focus on both providing ideas for preventing interference in 2018 and beyond, and also for holding us accountable to making sure that the measures that we put in place are successful in doing that. So I would hope that we will start to see the first results later this year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Senator Moran is up next, and I would just say again, for the benefit of those who are here, that after a couple of more questioners, we'll probably give the witness another short break.
Thank you.
We're getting about almost two-thirds through the list of members who are here to ask questions. Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, thank you for your, I'm over here. Thank you for your testimony and thank you for your presence here today. On March the 26th of this year, the FTC confirmed that it was investigating Facebook to determine whether its privacy practices violated the FTC Act or the consent order that Facebook entered into with the agency in 2011. I chair the Commerce Committee subcommittee that has jurisdiction over the Federal Trade Commission. I remain interested in Facebook's assertion that it rejects any suggestion of violating that consent order. Part 2 of that consent order requires that Facebook, quote, clearly and prominently display notice and obtain users' affirmative consent before sharing their information with, quote, any third party. My question is, how does the case of approximately 87 million Facebook friends having their data shared with a third party due to the consent of only 300,000 consenting users not violate that agreement?
Well, Senator, like I said earlier, I mean, our view is that we believe that we are in compliance with the consent order, but I think that we have a broader responsibility to protect people's privacy even beyond that. And in this specific case, the way that the platform worked, or that you could sign into an app and bring some of your information and some of your friends' information, is how we explained it would work. People had settings to that effect. We explained and they consented to it working that way. And the system basically worked as it was designed. The issue is that we designed the system in a way that wasn't good. And now we, starting in 2014, have changed the design of the system so that way it just massively restricts the amount of data access that a developer can get. Going forward,
I'm sorry, the 300,000 people, they were treated in a way that was appropriate. They consented, but you're not suggesting that the friends consented.
Senator, I believe that we rolled out this developer platform and that we explained to people how it worked and that they did consent to it. It makes sense, I think, to go through the way the platform works. I mean, it's in 2007, we announced the Facebook developer platform, and the idea was that you wanted to make more experiences social, right? So, for example, if you might want to have a calendar that can have your friends' birthdays on it, or you might want your address book to have your friends' pictures in it, or you might want a map that can show your friends' addresses on it. In order to do that, we needed to build a tool that allowed people to sign into an app and bring some of their information and some of their friends' information to those apps. We made it very clear that this is how it worked, and when people signed up for Facebook, they signed up for that as well. Now, a lot of good use cases came from that. I mean, there were games that were built, there were integrations with companies that I think we're familiar with, like Netflix and Spotify. But over time, what became clear was that that also enabled some abuse. And that's why in 2014, we took the step of changing the platform so now when people sign into an app, you do not bring some of your friends' information with you. You're only bringing your own information, and you're able to connect with friends who have also authorized that app directly.
Let me turn to your bug bounty program. Our subcommittee has had a hearing in regard to bug bounty. Your press release indicated that was one of the 6 changes that Facebook initially offered to crack down on platform abuses was to reward outside parties who find vulnerabilities. One concern I have regarding the utility of this approach is that the vulnerability disclosure programs are normally geared toward identifying unauthorized access to data, not pointing out data sharing arrangement that likely could harm someone, but technically abide by complex consent agreements. How do you see the bug bounty program that you've announced addressing the issue of that?
Sorry, could you clarify what specifically?
How do you see that the bug bounty program that you are and have announced will deal with the sharing of information not permissible as compared to just unauthorized access to data?
Senator, I'm not actually sure I understand this enough to speak to that specific point, and I can have my team follow up with you on the details of that. In general, bounty programs are an important part of the security arsenal for hardening a lot of systems. I think we should expect that we're going to invest a lot in hardening our systems ourselves, and that we're going to audit and investigate a lot of the folks in our ecosystem. But even with that, having the ability to enlist other third parties outside of the company to be able to help us out by giving them an incentive to point out when they see issues, I think is likely going to help us improve the security of the platform overall, which is why we did this.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Next up, Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, Mr. Zuckerberg. As you know, much of my life has been focused on low-income communities, poor communities, working-class communities, and trying to make sure they have a fair shake. This country has a very bad history of discriminatory practices towards low-income Americans and Americans of color, from the redlining, FHA practices, even to more recently, really discriminatory practices in the mortgage business. I've always seen technology as a promise to democratize our nation, expand access, expand opportunities. But unfortunately, we've also seen how platforms, technology platforms like Facebook, can actually be used to double down on discrimination and give people more sophisticated tools with which to discriminate. Now, in 2016, ProPublica revealed that advertisers could use ethnic affinity, a user's race, to market categories to potentially discriminate overall against Facebook users in the areas of housing, employment, and credit, echoing a dark history in this country, and also in violation of federal law. In 2016, Facebook committed to fixing this, that the advertisers who have access to this data, to fixing it. But unfortunately, a year later, as ProPublica's article showed, they found that the system Facebook built was still allowing housing ads without applying to go forward, without applying these new restrictions that were put on. Facebook then opted in a system that's very similar to what we've been talking about with Cambridge Analytica, that they could self-certify that they were not engaging in these practices and complying with federal law, using this self-certification way to overcome and to comply with, rather, Facebook's anti-discrimination policy. Unfortunately, in a recent lawsuit, as of February 2018, alleges that discriminatory ads were still being created on Facebook, still disproportionately impacting low-income communities and communities of color. Given the fact that you allowed Cambridge Analytica to self-certify in a way that I think, at least I think you've expressed regret over, is self-certification the best and strongest way to safeguard against the misuse of your platform and protect the data of users and not let it be manipulated in such a discriminatory fashion?
Senator, this is a very important question. And, you know, in general, I think over time we're going to move towards more proactive review with more AI tools to help flag problematic content. In the near term, we have a lot of content on the platform, and it's hard to review every single thing up front. We do a quick screen. But I agree with you that I think in this specific case, I'm not happy with where we are, and I think it makes sense to really focus on making sure that these areas get more review sooner.
And I know you understand that there is a growing distrust. I know a lot of civil rights organizations have met with you about Facebook's sense of urgency to address these issues. There's a distrust that stems from the fact, and I know I've had conversations with leaders in Facebook about the lack of diversity in the tech sector as well, people who are writing these algorithms, people who are actually policing for this data, policing for these problems. Are they going to be a part of a more diverse group that's looking at this? You're looking to hire, as you said, 5,000 new positions for, among other things, reviewing content. But we know in your industry, the inclusivity, that it's a real serious problem that you are an industry that lacks diversity in a very dramatic fashion. It's not just true with Facebook, it's true with the tech area as well. And so it's very important for me to communicate that larger sense of urgency and what a lot of civil rights organizations are concerned with. And we should be working towards a more collaborative approach. And I'm wondering if you'd be open to opening your platform for civil rights organizations to really audit a lot of these companies dealing in areas of credit and housing, to really audit what is actually happening and better have more transparency in working with your platform.
Senator, I think that's a very good idea, and I think we should follow up on the details of that.
I also want to say that there was an investigation, something that's very disturbing to me, is the fact that there have been law enforcement organizations that use Facebook's platform to surveil African-American organizations like Black Lives Matter. I know you've expressed support for the group, and Philando Castile's killing was broadcast live on Facebook. But there are a lot of communities of color worried that that data can be used to surveil groups like Black Lives Matter, like folks who are trying to organize against substantive issues of discrimination in this country. Is this something that you're committed to addressing and to ensuring that the freedoms that civil rights activists and others are not targeted or their work not being undermined, or people not using your platform to unfairly surveil and try to undermine the activities that those groups are doing?
Yes, Senator. I think that that's very important. We're committed to that. And in general, unless law enforcement has a very clear subpoena or ability or reason to get access to information, we're going to push back on that across the board.
And then I'd just like, for the record, because my time has expired, but there's a lawsuit against Facebook about discrimination, and you moved for the lawsuit to be dismissed because no harm was shown. Could you please submit to the record, could you believe that people of color were not recruited for various economic opportunities or being harmed? Can you please clarify why you moved to dismiss that lawsuit for the record?
For the record. Senator Heller's up next. Go to you.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Appreciate the time, and thank you for being here. I'm over here. Thanks. And thank you for taking time. I know it's been a long day, and I think you're at the final stretch here, but I'm glad that you are here. Yesterday, Facebook sent out a notification to 87 million users that information was given to Cambridge Analytica without their consent. My daughter was one of the 87 million, and some of my staff, all from Nevada, received this notification. Can you tell me how many Nevadans were among the 87 million that received this notification?
Senator, I don't have this broken out by state right now, but I can have my team follow up with you to get you the information.
Okay. I figured that would be the answer. If after hearing this, going through this hearing, and Nevadans no longer want to have a Facebook account, if that's the case, if a Facebook user deletes their account, do you delete their data?
Yes.
My kids have been on Facebook and Instagram for years. How long do you keep a user's data?
Sorry,
how long do you keep a user's data once they after they've left? If they choose to delete their account, how long do you keep their data?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I know we try to delete it as quickly as is reasonable. We have a lot of complex systems, and it takes a while to work through all that. But I think we try to move as quickly as possible, and I can follow up or have my team follow up to get you the data on that.
Okay. Have you ever said that you won't sell an ad based on personal information, simply that you wouldn't sell this data because of the usage of it goes too far?
Senator, could you clarify that?
Have you ever drawn the line on selling data to an advertiser?
Yes, Senator. We don't sell data at all. So the way the ad system works is advertisers can come to us and say, I have a message that I'm trying to reach a certain type of people. They might be interested in something. They might live in a place. And then we help them get that message in front of people. But this is one of it's widely mischaracterized about our system that we sell data. And it's actually one of the most important parts of how Facebook works is we do not sell data. Advertisers do not get access to people's individual data.
Have you ever collected the content of phone calls or messages through any Facebook application or service?
Senator, I don't believe we've ever collected the content of phone calls. We have an app called Messenger that allows people to message mostly their Facebook friends. And we do, on the Android operating system, allow people to use that app as their client for both Facebook messages and texts. So we do allow people to import their texts into that.
Okay. Let me ask you about government surveillance. For years, Facebook said that there should be strict limits on the information the government can access on Americans. And by the way, I agreed with you that because privacy is important to Nevadans. You argued that Facebook users wouldn't trust you if they thought you were giving their private information to the intelligence community. Yet you use and sell the same data to make money. And in the case of Cambridge Analytica, you don't even know how it's used after you sell it. Can you tell us why this isn't hypocritical?
Well, Senator, once again, we don't sell any data to anyone. We don't sell it to advertisers, and we don't sell it to developers. What we do allow is for people to sign into apps and bring their data, and it used to be the data of some of their friends, but now it isn't. with them. And that, I think, makes sense. I mean, it's basic data portability, the ability that you own the data, you should be able to take it from one app to another if you'd like.
Do you believe you're more responsible with millions of Americans' personal data than the federal government would be?
Yes. But, Senator, your point about surveillance, I think that there's a very important distinction to draw here, which is that when organizations do surveillance, people don't have control over that. But on Facebook, everything that you share there, you have control over. You can say, I don't want this information to be there. You have full access to understand every piece of information that Facebook might know about you, and you can get rid of all of it. And I don't know of any other any surveillance organization in the world that operates that way, which is why I think that comparison just isn't really apt here.
With you here today, do you think you're a victim?
No.
Do you think Facebook as a company is a victim?
Senator, no. I think we have a responsibility to protect everyone in our community from anyone in our ecosystem who is going to potentially harm them. And I think that we haven't done enough historically, and we need to step up and do more.
Do you consider the 87 million users, do you consider them victims?
Senator, I think, yes. I mean, they did not want their information to be sold to Cambridge Analytica by a developer. And that happened, and it happened on our watch. So even though we didn't do it, I think we have a responsibility to be able to prevent that and be able to take action sooner. And we're committing to make sure that we do that going forward, which is why the steps that I announced before are now, the two most important things that we're doing are locking down the platform to make sure that developers can't get access to that much data, so this can't happen again going forward, which I think is largely the case since 2014. And going backwards, we need to investigate every single app that might have had access to a large amount of people's data to make sure that no one else was misusing it. And if we find that they are, we're going to get into their systems, do a full audit, make sure they delete it, and we're going to tell everyone who's affected.
Mr. Chairman,
thank you, Senator Heller. We'll go to Senator Peters and then into the break, and then Senator Tillis coming out of the break. So, Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, thank you for being here today. You know, you've talked about your very humble beginnings in starting Facebook in your dorm room, which I appreciated that story, but certainly Facebook has changed an awful lot over a relatively short period of time. When Facebook launched its timeline feature, consumers saw their friends post chronologically, was the process. But Facebook has since then changed to a timeline driven by some very sophisticated algorithms. And I think it has left many people, as a result of that, asking, you know, why am I seeing this this feed, and why am I seeing this right now? And now, in light of the Cambridge Analytica, some new questions right now. Can I believe what I'm seeing? And who has access to this information about me? So I think it's safe to say, very simply, that Facebook is losing the trust of an awful lot of Americans as a result of this incident. And I think an example of this is something that I've been hearing a lot from folks who have been coming up to me and talking about really kind of an experience they've had where they're having a conversation with friends, not on the phone, just talking, and then they see ads popping up fairly quickly on their Facebook. So I've heard constituents fear that Facebook is mining audio from their mobile devices for the purpose of ad targeting, which I think speaks to this lack of trust that we're seeing here. But and I understand there's some technical issues and logistical issues for that to happen, but for the record, I think it's clear, saying I hear it all the time, including from my own staff. Yes or no, does Facebook use audio obtained from mobile devices to enrich personal information about its users?
No.
Good.
Well, Senator, let me be clear on this. I mean, so you're talking about this conspiracy theory that gets passed around that we listen to what's going on your microphone and use that for ads.
Right.
We don't do that. To be clear, we do allow people to take videos on their devices and share those. And of course, videos also have audio. So so we do, while you're taking a video, record that and use that to make the service better by making sure that your videos have audio. But I mean, that I think is pretty clear. But I just wanted to make sure I was exhaustive there.
Well, I appreciate that, and hopefully that'll dispel a lot of what I've been hearing, so thank you for saying that. Certainly, today, in the era of mega data, we are finding that data drives everything, including consumer behavior. And so consumer information is probably the most valuable information you can get in the data ecosystem. And certainly, folks, as you've mentioned in your testimony here, people like the fact that they can have targeted ads that they're going to be interested in as opposed to being bombarded by a lot of ads that they don't have any interest in. And that consumer information is important in order for you to tailor that. But also people are now beginning to wonder, is there an expense to that when it comes to perhaps exposing them to being manipulated or through deception? You've talked about artificial intelligence. You brought that up many times during your testimony. And I know you've employed some new algorithms to target bots, bring down fake accounts, deal with terrorism, things that you've talked about in this hearing.